The courtroom in Denver was colder than usual that morning, though no one could explain why. Perhaps it was the case itself. Perhaps it was the sight of a 3-year-old child sitting in the second row, her small shoes not even touching the floor. Lily Thompson sat quietly beside her grandmother, wrapped in a soft yellow sweater that seemed too bright for such a serious place. Her curls framed a pale face that hadn't smiled in weeks. One of her tiny hands rested deep inside the golden fur of the dog pressed against her leg. Max. He was a full-grown golden retriever, strong and broad-chested, yet remarkably still. His leash lay loose on the floor. He wasn't packing. He wasn't distracted by the unfamiliar smells or the echo of shuffling papers. His dark eyes were fixed on one person only. Daniel Thompson. Lily's father stood at the defense table, adjusting his tie for the third time in 2 minutes. His lawyer whispered something to him, but Daniel's gaze kept drifting toward the child, toward the dog. The room buzzed with low conversation as spectators filled the wooden benches. Some had read about the case in the local news. Others were simply curious. A father accused of neglect. A child found wandering outside at dawn. No clear evidence. No visible injuries. Just a frightened little girl who had stopped speaking. And a dog who refused to leave her side. When the bailiff announced the judge's entrance, everyone rose. Chairs scraped against the floor in uneven rhythm. Lily flinched slightly at the sudden noise. Max immediately leaned closer, pressing against her leg. His movement was subtle but deliberate. Her grandmother noticed. She stroked Lily's hair gently, whispering, "It's okay, sweetheart." The judge took her seat, scanning the courtroom with practiced calm. She paused for a fraction of a second when her eyes landed on the child and the dog. Animals were not common in her courtroom, but permission had been granted under special consideration. The dog, she'd been told, helped keep the child stable. The trial began. The prosecutor stood first, outlining the events that led to Daniel's arrest. She spoke clearly, methodically, describing how Lily had been found outside her home before sunrise. Barefoot, shivering, silent. A neighbor had called authorities after spotting her near the edge of the driveway, staring at nothing. Max had been beside her. He hadn't barked for help, he hadn't run away, he had simply stayed. As the prosecutor spoke, Lily's fingers tightened slightly in the dog's fur. Max's ear flicked back, sensing the shift in her breathing. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes forward. Toward Daniel. When it was the defense's turn, Daniel's attorney painted a different picture. A misunderstanding, a faulty door latch, a child who wandered, a loving father unfairly accused. Daniel nodded along, jaw set, eyes tired but defensive. Then he cleared his throat. It was a small sound, barely noticeable. But Max reacted instantly. His body stiffened, muscles tightening beneath his golden coat. His head lifted just a fraction higher. His eyes sharpened. Several people in the gallery noticed. Daniel began to speak, recounting the morning Lily had been found outside. He claimed he had been asleep. He said he had no idea she had left her room. His voice carried across the courtroom, calm but edged with irritation. As he continued, Lily's breathing changed. It was almost imperceptible at first. A shallow inhale, a slight tremble in her shoulders. Her grandmother leaned closer, concerned, but Lily didn't look up. She just stared at the floor. Max shifted. Not dramatically, not aggressively. He adjusted his position so that his body was slightly more in front of Lily than beside her. His shoulder brushed against her knee, forming a quiet barrier. Daniel kept talking. Every time his tone rose even slightly, Max's ears angled forward. When Daniel gestured with his hands, the dog's eyes followed the movement carefully. The courtroom air grew heavier. The prosecutor noticed the pattern first. She paused her note-taking and watched. The defense attorney, too focused on his client's testimony, didn't see it immediately. But the jurors did. They watched the dog the way people watch a storm cloud forming in the distance, unsure whether it would pass or break. Daniel's voice grew sharper as he insisted he would never harm his daughter. "I love my child," he said firmly, glancing toward Lily. The moment his eyes met hers, Lily's head dropped. Max stood up. It wasn't sudden enough to cause chaos. It was controlled, measured. He rose to all fours and stepped forward, positioning himself fully between Lily and her father's line of sight. A murmur rippled through the benches. The judge lifted her gaze immediately. "Is the dog under control?" she asked calmly. "Yes, Your Honor," Lily's grandmother replied softly. "He's trained." Max did not bark, he did not lunge. He simply stood there, body aligned like a shield. His tail was still, his stance firm. Daniel faltered for half a second before continuing his statement. But something had changed. The attention in the room was no longer focused solely on words. It was on reactions, on patterns, on instincts. The prosecutor slowly approached the podium for cross-examination. She asked Daniel simple questions at first, about his routine, about Lily's behavior in the weeks leading up to the incident. Max remained standing. Every time Daniel shifted his weight forward, the dog's muscles tightened. Every time Daniel's voice grew louder, a faint rumble vibrated in Max's chest, not loud enough to interrupt, but deep enough to feel. Lily still hadn't spoken. She hadn't looked up once, but her small hand moved slightly. 2 fingers pressed into Max's fur, not pulling, not gripping, just resting there as if confirming he was real. The judge leaned back in her chair, studying the scene carefully. She had presided over hundreds of cases. She understood theatrics. She understood manipulation. This didn't feel like either. There was no command given to the dog, no visible cue from the grandmother, no tension on the leash. There was only a child who seemed to shrink when her father spoke, and a dog who refused to let that shrinking happen alone. Daniel's testimony continued for nearly 30 minutes. By the end, his confidence had thinned. His voice lacked the earlier sharpness. Whether it was the questioning or the weight of dozens of watching eyes, something unsettled him. Max never moved from his position. When the judge finally called for a short recess, the gavel sound echoed sharply through the chamber. Lily flinched again at the noise. Max immediately turned toward her, pressing his head gently against her chest. And for the first time that morning, Lily wrapped both arms around his neck. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. But it was the first clear sign of comfort she had shown all day. As people began filing out for the break, whispers filled the hallway. They weren't talking about legal arguments. They were talking about the dog. Inside the courtroom, Daniel remained seated, staring at Max with something unreadable in his expression, frustration perhaps, or disbelief. Max stared back. Calm, unblinking, protective. The trial was only beginning. No verdict had been reached, no conclusions formally drawn. But something undeniable had already happened. In a room built for testimony and evidence, it was a silent animal who had shifted the atmosphere. A golden retriever who seemed to understand something the adults were still trying to piece together. And as Lily clung to him during the recess, one thing was clear. Max wasn't reacting to noise. He was reacting to something deeper. Something only he and Lily seemed to fully understand. When court resumed, everyone would be watching more closely. Not just the father, but the dog. The story of Lily Thompson began long before the courtroom ever knew her name. At just 3 years old, she had a life that, to the outside world, seemed ordinary. A small house in a quiet suburban neighborhood of Denver, a backyard with flowers her mother used to tend, and a family that on paper looked functional. But the morning Lily wandered outside alone would shatter that image. It had been an early, chilly spring dawn. The sky was still gray and the neighborhood lay in heavy silence. The streetlights flickered as if unsure whether the night had truly passed. Lily's tiny feet shuffled across the driveway. She had no shoes, no coat, nothing to shield her from the cold. Her curly hair hung damp around her face, and her lips trembled from both the temperature and something deeper, a fear that had been growing for months. At her side, Max trotted silently, his golden fur almost glowing in the dim light. The neighbors who later discovered her described him as calm and alert, watching over her like a sentinel. He didn't bark, didn't whine, didn't try to bring attention to them. He simply stayed between Lily and the unknown dangers that loomed in her tiny world. When the neighbor called the authorities, she found Lily standing still, staring at nothing. She would not answer questions. She would not speak, not a word. Even as the first police officers arrived, Lily remained quiet, her small hands clutching Max's fur as if he were the only anchor to reality she still had. The child psychologists and social workers who later interviewed her were puzzled. She was alert, intelligent, and aware of her surroundings, yet she refused to speak. She had been so full of words before. Now only silence remained. Weeks passed. At the shelter where Lily and Max were placed temporarily for protection, therapists tried every tactic, drawing, puppets, picture cards, even singing. Nothing worked. Lily would participate silently at times, mimicking actions but never speaking. Max remained her constant companion, ever watchful. He seemed to sense what no one else could: Lily's fear, her caution, and the unspoken truth of what had happened at home. The pattern with her father, Daniel Thompson, had become undeniable. During supervised visits arranged by Child Protective Services, Lily would visibly shrink whenever Daniel moved toward her. She would huddle behind her grandmother, clutch Max's fur, and avoid eye contact. Max, in turn, positioned himself as a barrier. If Daniel raised his hand or spoke too loudly, Max's body tensed. He would step between them, his gaze fixed, ears alert, muscles coiled like a spring. The defense called it coincidence. Perhaps, they argued, the dog was simply protective in general, but the repetition, the psychologists noted, was striking. Every reaction was consistent with trauma response. Every reaction was triggered by Daniel's presence alone. The small, silent girl could not articulate what had happened, but her dog's instincts were clear. Lily's grandmother often described it at home. "Max knows," she whispered to visiting friends and relatives. "He knows what she's afraid of. He doesn't leave her side. He never does." Even in the quiet moments at home, when Daniel wasn't present, Max would sometimes sit alertly by the door, his eyes scanning for any signs of tension or threat, as if he were still protecting her from unseen dangers. The courtroom had not yet seen this side of Lily. They had read the reports, the psychological assessments, the case notes, but nothing could prepare them for the scene that would unfold when Daniel finally stepped into the room for testimony. On the morning of the first day of the trial, Lily arrived with her grandmother, tucked into the corner of the courtroom. Max padded silently beside her, his movements slow and controlled. She clutched him tightly, as though holding on to him gave her courage she could not find in words. The murmurs of the courtroom seemed to fade into the background for her. She didn't notice the reporters or the spectators. She didn't notice the cameras or the cameras' flashes. She noticed only Max. Daniel's defense attorney tried to make the atmosphere feel routine, hoping that the presence of a dog and a frightened child wouldn't sway the jury. "We are dealing with a family issue, not a criminal one," he said, gesturing to Lily. "She is under stress, yes, but children react differently to different situations. This court should focus on evidence, not theatrics." But Max did not understand legal arguments. He did not care about paperwork or testimony. He understood only one thing: the child's fear and the presence of the person she was afraid of. As Daniel approached the witness stand, Lily's fingers tightened into Max's thick fur. She did not speak. She did not flinch overtly, but Max's ears flicked, his tail shifted slightly, and his muscles tensed. A faint growl escaped his throat, low and warning, unnoticed by some but deeply felt by those paying attention. Observers would later describe the reaction as chilling. The room felt colder, chairs shifted. Even Daniel paused mid-step. Something in the air had changed, something beyond words, beyond argument. During the cross-examination, the prosecution gently asked Daniel about his routines, his behavior at home, his interactions with Lily. Max responded with subtle cues every time Daniel's voice rose or his posture became assertive. He positioned himself closer to Lily. His gaze never left Daniel. Every juror saw it. Every observer felt it. Lily still did not speak, but she had begun signaling in tiny ways, a twitch of her fingers, a shift in her position, a slight nod toward Max. She communicated without words, a silent conversation that only Max could fully interpret. The bond between them had grown stronger than any spoken language could convey. At lunch, as the courtroom emptied for recess, Lily pressed her small forehead against Max's shoulder. She whispered a soft, trembling sound, not yet words, but a sigh that carried relief. The dog's warmth comforted her. In that moment, the silent child and the silent dog were united in a language of instinct, trust, and protection. By the time the afternoon session resumed, word of Max's behavior had already circulated among the staff, the court officers, and some of the spectators. People were curious but cautious. A dog in a courtroom was unusual. A dog responding to trauma signals in a child was extraordinary. For Lily, Max's presence was everything. She had been voiceless for weeks, unable to communicate the fear that had built up inside her. But Max understood. He had been her shield, her protector, her interpreter, silently narrating her emotions to the adults who could not see them. As the trial continued, the relationship between Lily and Max became the invisible center of the courtroom's attention. Jurors, attorneys, and even the judge began to watch their interactions closely, understanding that the dog's reactions were not random. They were meaningful. They were intentional. By the end of that first day, one thing was clear. Lily may have been silent, but she was not powerless. And Max, the golden retriever who had stood beside her in the quiet dawn outside her home, was not just a pet. He was a witness, a guardian, a force that could not be ignored. The courtroom would see much more in the days to come. But for now, the first layer of truth had been revealed, that even when words fail, loyalty, instinct, and courage have their own voice, and sometimes that voice is loud enough to stop a room in its tracks. The courtroom had settled into a tense rhythm by mid-morning. Lawyers shuffled papers, the stenographer typed furiously, and the jurors leaned forward in their seats, eyes darting between the child and the father. But the true focus, though unspoken, was Max, the golden retriever who had, without a single word, captured the attention of everyone present. Judge Margaret Collins, a veteran of more than 15 years presiding over Denver's family courts, glanced down at the small figure huddled near the bench. Lily Thompson's tiny hand remained buried in Max's thick golden fur. The dog's eyes never left Daniel Thompson. The judge had seen chaos, deception, and theatrics in her courtroom before, but nothing like this. The morning's proceedings had already made it clear. The child could not speak, and the father, though outwardly composed, had an air of tension that seemed to radiate through the room. Max's subtle growls, his stiffened posture, and the protective barrier he formed around Lily had shifted the dynamic. The adults had begun to pay attention to something they had previously dismissed: canine instinct. During a break, the prosecution approached Judge Collins with a motion that, frankly, was unusual. "Your Honor," said Assistant District Attorney Maria Delgado, "we request permission to allow a qualified behavioral specialist to testify regarding the dog's protective behavior. We believe Max's reactions are significant in understanding the dynamics of fear and trauma in this child." The defense attorney's face tightened immediately. "Your Honor, this is absurd," he said, rising from his chair. "We are here to assess facts, evidence, and legal testimony, not the behavior of a family pet. This is not a circus." Judge Collins raised her hand calmly, her eyes scanning the crowded room. "I am aware this is not standard practice," she said. "However, given the child's inability to speak and the dog's unusual and consistent reactions to the defendant, I will allow limited testimony regarding behavioral patterns. It will be relevant to the context of the child's fear and the evidence before the court." The courtroom murmured at the unusual ruling. Some leaned forward, curiosity piqued. Others exchanged skeptical glances. A dog in the courtroom, and now testimony about its instincts. Yet the judge had made her decision. The trial would proceed. Later that afternoon, the specialist entered the room. Dr. Emily Harper, a certified canine behaviorist with years of experience working with therapy and protection animals. She carried herself with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to explaining complex animal behavior to humans who often misunderstood it. "Your Honor," Dr. Harper began, "I have observed Max extensively. He has no history of aggression, no prior incidents, but in the context of this child, his behavior is consistent with protective instincts triggered by repeated exposure to fear. These behaviors are not random. They are patterned, consistent, and intentional." She walked slowly to the witness stand, gestures precise and deliberate. "I have watched videos of supervised visits. Max consistently places his body between the child and the defendant when the child shows signs of stress. When the father raises his voice, Max stiffens. When he gestures abruptly, Max positions himself closer. These are classic protective responses." The jurors were attentive, some leaning forward as though the words themselves were heavy with meaning. Max, lying quietly beside Lily, seemed to understand that he was the topic of discussion. His ears twitched slightly as Dr. Harper spoke. One juror whispered to another, "He's not just reacting, he's anticipating." Dr. Harper continued, "Dogs can pick up on nonverbal cues that humans might miss. Heart rate changes, breathing patterns, subtle body language. Max is responding to these cues consistently in a way that demonstrates protective concern. In other words, this dog is aware of the child's distress and is actively responding to prevent further harm." The defense attorney objected. "Your Honor, this is speculative. We cannot allow a dog's behavior to be used as evidence of guilt." Judge Collins held up a hand. "The testimony is not evidence of guilt. It is evidence of context and behavioral patterns. The jury will decide what weight to give it. Continue, Dr. Harper." Dr. Harper nodded. She then elaborated on trauma-linked canine responses. In children who have experienced fear or potential harm, dogs can become extensions of their communication. Protective behaviors such as blocking, growling, or positioning themselves strategically are forms of communication. The dog is effectively telling the observer, "Something is wrong. I am protecting the child." Max shifted slightly. His head lifted, ears angled forward. His eyes locked onto Daniel. The subtle growl that had caused murmurs earlier returned, quiet but deliberate. The courtroom went still. Even Daniel, seated at the defense table, felt an unfamiliar tension creeping into his chest. He looked at Max, trying to gauge the dog's intent. Dr. Harper continued, showing video evidence to the court. Each clip demonstrated the same pattern, the child showing minor signs of fear, a slight flinch, a hesitant step, and Max responding almost instantaneously, placing his body between her and the source of distress. "This is not coincidental," she concluded. "The dog's behavior is learned in conjunction with the child's experiences and reactions, but it is also instinctual. He protects without instruction because he senses danger that the child cannot articulate." The jurors were silent. Some scribbled notes, others simply stared, absorbing the unprecedented display of instinctive loyalty. Lily, still huddled against Max, looked at him now with a mixture of awe and trust. Even at 3, she knew he understood her. The defense tried to counter, emphasizing that dogs react to stimuli all the time, not necessarily signaling abuse. But Dr. Harper's testimony was meticulous. She cited studies on canine empathy, behavioral patterns in trauma contexts, and instances of dogs serving as unofficial witnesses in family disputes. One particularly striking clip showed Max lying quietly near Lily's feet. Daniel raised his voice slightly. Max immediately shifted, placing his body between Lily and Daniel. Lily's small fingers pressed into his fur. She did not cry, she did not scream, she simply leaned into him, trusting his protection. The prosecutor paused the presentation. The courtroom, previously distracted by procedural matters, was now silent. Every person in the room seemed to feel the weight of the dog's silent testimony. Judge Collins cleared her throat. "We will take a short recess," she said. The gavel echoed, yet unlike the earlier interruption, Lily did not flinch. Max remained alert, eyes following the judge. In the hallway, whispered conversations erupted. Staff, reporters, and jurors exchanged incredulous glances. A dog had, in effect, become a key observer in a case of child neglect. No one had ever witnessed anything quite like it in this courtroom. During the break, Lily's grandmother knelt beside her, smoothing back her curls. "He's watching out for you," she whispered softly. Lily leaned her forehead into Max's shoulder. For a moment, the 3-year-old smiled faintly, an almost imperceptible curve of her lips. Max, sensing both reassurance and the importance of the moment, sat perfectly still. His presence was commanding without being aggressive, calm without being passive, the perfect intermediary between the child and the adults who struggled to interpret her silence. As the court reconvened, the tension returned. Daniel Thompson returned to the stand, but now the dynamic had shifted. Max's role was undeniable. The jurors could see it. The attorneys could see it. And Lily, quiet as ever, had begun to communicate in the only language she could, subtle gestures and trust in her dog. The trial had only just begun, but the first layer of truth had been revealed. Not through testimony, not through documents, not through traditional evidence, but through instinct, loyalty, and the silent bond between a child and her protector. Max's eyes never left Daniel as he resumed his testimony. The courtroom had learned something profound. Sometimes the smallest witnesses are the most honest, and sometimes their voices are made of fur, growls, and unblinking devotion. By the end of that day, no one in the courtroom doubted one thing. Max was not just a dog. He was a guardian, a witness, and a vital part of Lily's ability to survive, communicate, and eventually heal. The second day of the trial began under an atmosphere heavier than the first. The courtroom in Denver was filled with quiet tension. Spectators, reporters, and jurors alike had come to witness a case that already felt unprecedented. The story of a 3-year-old girl, her silent suffering, and a golden retriever who seemed to understand her fear had captured everyone's attention. Lily Thompson sat with her grandmother at the corner of the courtroom, a yellow sweater wrapping her fragile frame. Her tiny fingers gripped Max's fur tightly. Max, for his part, was alert but controlled, muscles coiled and ears angled forward. He had been with Lily for nearly 4 years, trained to provide comfort and emotional support. But this trial demanded something more, instincts and awareness beyond simple training. Daniel Thompson took the stand again. His eyes scanned the courtroom as if searching for a lifeline among the spectators. His hands fidgeted, the subtle twitch of nervousness betraying the calm he attempted to project. He began recounting the morning when Lily had been found wandering outside. His voice was steady, but there was a tightness in his jaw, a tension that had not been there the previous day. Lily did not move. She did not cry, she did not even glance at him. But her breathing was shallow, her small shoulders rising and falling rapidly. Max noticed instantly. Then it happened. A movement so slight that most people would have missed it. Lily, still pressed against Max's shoulder, lifted a tiny hand and tapped twice against her leg. 2 soft, almost imperceptible taps. The room went silent. Max reacted immediately. There was no hesitation, no confusion. He rose to his full height and moved so that his body was directly in front of Lily, shielding her from Daniel. His stance was deliberate, controlled, and protective. His growl was low and warning, resonating through the tense courtroom without being loud enough to alarm anyone outside the immediate vicinity. Daniel froze mid-sentence. His words faltered. He stared at the dog, trying to decipher what he could not. The defense attorney sputtered in protest, attempting to regain control, but the moment had already passed into something far more powerful than any verbal argument. The jurors who had seen the dog's subtle behaviors on the previous day now witnessed a dramatic escalation. This was no random reaction. This was intentional, instinctive, and precise. Max was acting as Lily's voice, her barrier, and her protector all at once. The judge, Honorable Margaret Collins, leaned forward in her seat. She had presided over many unusual cases, but nothing like this. She could feel the energy shift in the room, a palpable tension that even words could not convey. Max was making a statement, and in that moment she recognized the gravity of what was unfolding before her eyes. The prosecution rose slowly. "Your Honor," Assistant District Attorney Maria Delgado said, her voice calm but carrying weight, "the child is signaling through the dog. This is consistent with trauma responses and protective behavior." She gestured subtly to the dog. The dog is not just reacting. He is interpreting and communicating the child's fear. Dr. Emily Harper, the canine behaviorist, had been seated at the back of the courtroom. She leaned forward and spoke quietly but clearly. "This behavior is deliberate. The dog understands the child's cues and is acting in accordance with her unspoken commands. This is a protective response, not aggression. The growl, the positioning, the alertness, all indicate recognition of a perceived threat and active intervention." The defense attorney objected immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. This is circumstantial. You cannot convict a man because a dog interpreted a child's fear." Judge Collins held up her hand, silencing the objection. "The testimony is not evidence of guilt in isolation," she said firmly. "It is evidence of behavioral context, and the jury will determine its weight. Proceed." Max did not move. He maintained his position, eyes locked on Daniel. He shifted his weight slightly forward, lowering his head in a subtle display of warning, muscles tense, tail still. Lily pressed herself closer to him, small arms wrapped around his neck. The courtroom was captivated. Even the spectators who had been whispering now held their breath. A 3-year-old girl, still unable to speak, had communicated clearly, and Max had responded perfectly. Daniel tried to continue speaking, but his voice faltered. Each word felt heavier as Max maintained his protective stance. His instinctive barrier seemed to grow stronger with every second, almost as if he were absorbing the tension and transmitting it to the room. One juror later described the moment as eerily powerful, recalling the simultaneous silence, tension, and clarity in the room. It was as if the dog's body had replaced words, forming a message that no one could ignore. Lily's grandmother leaned down, brushing a hand over her granddaughter's hair. "It's okay," she whispered softly. "He's protecting you." Lily did not respond verbally, but she nuzzled closer to Max, seeking comfort in his presence. He had become more than a dog. He was a shield, a silent communicator, and an extension of her voice. Assistant DA Delgado took the opportunity to ask a simple question, carefully phrased to maintain the child's comfort. "Lily, did Max protect you?" There was no verbal response. Instead, Lily gave the slightest nod, almost imperceptible but undeniable. Max shifted slightly in acknowledgement, leaning into her, calming and reassuring. The judge's gaze lingered on the scene. She could feel the weight of the moment. Here was a child who could not speak, a father whose guilt or innocence was still under scrutiny, and a dog who had stepped in as witness and guardian. The jurors' attention was fixed. The courtroom had been transformed from a place of dry testimony into a stage for instinctive truth. Max was not performing. He was acting on instinct, and everyone present sensed the significance. Daniel's face was pale now. The confident posture he had held earlier had vanished. He glanced at the dog, then at the child. For the first time, uncertainty crept into his expression. The defense attorney tried to redirect the court, emphasizing that canine behavior could not conclusively prove abuse or neglect. But even his words seemed hollow against the visual impact of Max's unwavering vigilance. Max remained between Lily and her father for several tense minutes, each second amplifying the courtroom's focus. Finally, Judge Collins called for another recess. The gavel echoed through the chamber. Lily exhaled softly, pressing her forehead against Max's shoulder. In that brief pause, spectators whispered to each other. The unusual bond between child and dog was now the central focus of the trial. Every observer felt the gravity of what they had just witnessed. Outside the courtroom, reporters jostled for position, eager to describe what they called the dog who testified. Social workers and psychologists later cited the scene as a rare but powerful example of nonverbal communication, trauma recognition, and protective instincts in animals. Back inside, Lily's grandmother stroked her hair, whispering, "He's not letting anything hurt you." Lily clutched Max tightly. Max had made a statement without a single word. He had shielded, warned, and interpreted. And in doing so, he had forever altered the way everyone in the room understood the case. For Lily, the signal had been simple, a tap on her leg, but the meaning was profound. Fear was recognized. Protection was enacted. The silent witness had spoken loud enough for all to hear. By the end of the day, one truth was undeniable. Max had become more than a pet. He was a guardian, a communicator, and the key to unraveling the mystery of the child's silence. And the courtroom, once filled with ordinary observers, now understood the extraordinary. The trial had taken an unexpected turn. It was no longer just about testimony or documents. It was about instinct, loyalty, and a bond that transcended words. And the world would soon watch as that bond guided the rest of the proceedings. The courtroom was unusually still when proceedings resumed after the lunch break. The murmur of whispered conversations and shuffling papers had faded. Jurors, spectators, and attorneys alike were still processing what they had witnessed earlier. A 3-year-old girl signaling a golden retriever with a subtle tap on her leg, and the dog responding with instinctive, deliberate protection. Judge Margaret Collins sat at her bench, her eyes scanning the room but frequently returning to the corner where Lily Thompson sat. The child was small, her yellow sweater a bright contrast to the muted tones of the courtroom. Her fingers were entwined in Max's golden fur, and the dog's eyes remained unwaveringly focused on Daniel Thompson. Daniel had returned to the stand for continued testimony. He looked more uneasy than before. Perhaps it was the memory of Max stepping in front of Lily, blocking him from view. Perhaps it was the realization that every subtle motion he made seemed to draw an instinctive response from the dog. Either way, his confidence had noticeably waned. The defense attorney attempted to redirect the focus. "Your Honor, this has gone far enough," he said quietly, leaning toward Daniel. "The dog's behavior is circumstantial. It cannot be used as evidence of any wrongdoing." Judge Collins, however, had seen enough. She had spent years presiding over family court cases, and she knew instinct when she saw it. The courtroom had already demonstrated that it understood instinct's weight. She raised a hand to quiet the murmuring attorneys. "This courtroom," she began slowly, her voice deliberate, "has witnessed something unusual, but it is relevant. We are not here to weigh the dog's actions in isolation. We are here to observe behavioral patterns that illuminate the child's experience. The dog's presence and his responses to stimuli are relevant to understanding the child's perspective." Max shifted slightly, leaning closer to Lily. His posture was alert but controlled, muscles coiled beneath his golden coat. He was not aggressive. He was a sentinel, a silent protector. His focus was absolute. Dr. Emily Harper, the canine behaviorist who had testified earlier, remained seated at the back of the courtroom. She had been observing the day's proceedings closely, taking notes on Max's reactions. When Daniel adjusted his position to lean forward, Max shifted, placing himself more squarely between the child and the father. His growl was barely audible, but the tension in the courtroom rose perceptibly. Even Daniel noticed. His voice wavered slightly as he began to answer a question from the prosecutor about his morning routines. He gestured with his hands, trying to illustrate a point. Max reacted immediately, stiffening, stepping just slightly closer to Lily. Judge Collins froze. She did not call for the gavel. She did not scold the dog. She simply watched. She recognized instinct when she saw it, and what she saw was undeniable. Max was not reacting randomly. His behavior was deliberate, purposeful, and protective. The jurors shifted in their seats. They had seen the dog respond consistently over the previous days, and now the live demonstration was undeniable. Every subtle twitch, every shift in posture, every low growl carried meaning. They were witnessing a silent testimony that words could not convey. The prosecutor, Maria Delgado, gently probed further. "Mr. Thompson," she asked, "did you ever notice the child's reactions during daily routines at home? Did she ever seem afraid around you?" Daniel's response faltered. "No," he said finally, voice uncertain. I don't know what you're talking about." Max's ears flicked forward. He shifted his stance, placing himself firmly between Lily and Daniel. His gaze was unwavering, piercing. It was clear to everyone in the room that the dog had detected something, some unspoken tension, that the adults could not yet articulate. Judge Collins leaned forward in her chair, eyes narrowing slightly. The gavel rested unused in front of her, a silent symbol of authority. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Max's posture, unyielding yet controlled, had drawn a line in the sand. He had made his position clear, and everyone present understood that even the most confident verbal arguments could not negate the dog's instincts. Lily, seated against her grandmother, did not speak, but her small fingers tapped subtly against Max's fur. The taps were rhythmic, almost imperceptible, yet they communicated volumes to the golden retriever. Max responded instantly, reinforcing his protective stance. The defense attorney rose, attempting to regain control. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. A dog cannot be permitted to dictate the direction of testimony." Judge Collins remained unmoved. "The dog is not dictating testimony," she replied firmly. "The dog's behavior is evidence of behavioral context, a window into the child's perception of threat. This is relevant, and the jury may consider it accordingly." Max's growl deepened, still controlled. He shifted to position himself slightly in front of Lily, lowering his head, muscles tensed. Daniel's hands tightened into fists. He was beginning to realize the implications of the situation. For the first time, he appeared genuinely unsettled. The jurors watched with rapt attention. Some scribbled notes, others simply observed, absorbing the silent message being conveyed by Max. No words were spoken by the dog, but the courtroom understood. A threat was perceived and protection was enacted. Dr. Harper stood to clarify, gesturing to Max. "This behavior," she said, "is not learned by command. This is instinctive, triggered by repeated exposure to the child's stress signals. The dog is communicating protective intent, and it is consistent across multiple instances. His responses are deliberate, not random." The courtroom remained still. Even reporters who had covered countless dramatic cases whispered among themselves. The scene unfolding before them was unprecedented. A child who could not speak, a dog who could not testify, yet a message of fear, trust, and protection being conveyed to every adult present. Daniel's voice wavered as he tried to continue. Each word seemed heavier than the last. Max's eyes remained locked on him, unflinching. Every shift in Daniel's posture, every slight movement, was mirrored by the dog's protective adjustments. Judge Collins finally spoke, her voice measured but firm. "We will proceed with the understanding that this dog is a behavioral witness of sorts. While not giving testimony in the conventional sense, he is a live observer of the child's interactions with her father. The jury may consider these observations when evaluating the totality of circumstances." The tension in the room was palpable. Max remained poised, every muscle taut with vigilance. Lily, small and silent, pressed against him, drawing courage from his presence. At that moment, a subtle shift occurred. Lily lifted her head slightly and tapped once more on Max's fur. The dog's response was immediate, a growl, low and controlled, and a slight adjustment of his stance to reinforce his protective position. Judge Collins froze. The gavel stayed untouched. The courtroom fell into a silence so profound it felt heavy. Everyone understood what had happened. A 3-year-old had communicated fear without speaking. A dog had responded instinctively and deliberately to protect her. And the judge, seasoned as she was, recognized the significance of the moment. Even Daniel Thompson seemed to understand. His confident posture faltered. His eyes flicked between Lily and Max. For the first time, uncertainty, fear, and realization crept into his expression. Outside observers later described the moment as electrifying. The courtroom had become more than a venue for legal proceedings. It had become a stage for instinct, trust, and silent communication. Max was the central figure, a living testament to loyalty, perception, and courage. When the recess was finally called, Lily buried her face into Max's shoulder, letting out a quiet sigh. The dog leaned into her, calm yet alert, ready to defend, ready to communicate, ready to act again if necessary. Judge Collins sat back in her chair, her mind racing. She had presided over hundreds of cases, but she had never witnessed anything like this. Words had been exchanged, evidence presented, but it was a dog, silent, instinctive, and unwavering, that had changed the dynamics of the courtroom. For Lily, the signal had been simple, a tap on the leg, but its impact reverberated far beyond her small hands. It had stopped the courtroom, focused every eye, and conveyed a truth that words could not. By the end of that session, everyone understood. Max was not merely a companion. He was a witness, a protector, and an unspoken voice for a child too young and too frightened to speak for herself. And the trial was only beginning. The courtroom had settled into an uneasy silence, a quiet tension that made the wooden walls seem heavier, the air thicker. Every person present, from jurors to spectators, seemed to feel the weight of what was about to happen. Lily Thompson, 3 years old, sat beside her grandmother, a small figure wrapped in a yellow sweater, fingers curled into Max's golden fur. The dog's dark eyes never left Daniel Thompson, who sat at the stand, attempting to maintain composure but betraying a subtle unease he could not hide. For weeks, Lily had not spoken a word. Her silence had been both heartbreaking and confounding. Psychologists had tried everything to coax a response from her: drawing, puppets, picture cards, singing, even storytelling, yet nothing had broken through the wall of fear and trauma. Max had always been her silent interpreter, her shield, and her constant companion. Where words had failed, instinct had thrived. As Daniel resumed his testimony, recalling minor details of the day Lily had wandered outside, Max's body shifted. He rose slightly, placing himself fully between Lily and her father, a protective barrier that the courtroom had come to recognize. His growl was soft, controlled, but unmistakable, resonating with a clear message: danger perceived. Lily's fingers pressed into his fur, small taps that only he seemed to understand. Max responded immediately, adjusting his stance, lowering his head slightly, muscles tense but restrained. The subtle communication between child and dog was mesmerizing. Every juror leaned in unconsciously, observing the interplay of instinct and trust unfold before their eyes. Judge Margaret Collins watched intently. She had presided over hundreds of family court cases, but she had never witnessed a dynamic like this. She knew instinct when she saw it, and Max's behavior was deliberate, precise, and protective. It was as if the dog carried the unspoken truth that the courtroom had yet to hear. Assistant District Attorney Maria Delgado saw the moment and decided to proceed carefully. "Lily," she said gently, crouching slightly to meet the child's eye level without intruding, "can you tell us if Max is protecting you?" The courtroom collectively held its breath. This was unprecedented. For weeks, Lily had remained silent, barely responsive even to familiar voices. Yet now, with her dog pressed to her side, she lifted her tiny head slightly and whispered a single, trembling sentence. "Max says no." The words were barely audible, but the courtroom fell into profound silence. Every adult present recognized the weight of the statement. It was a declaration, a testimony from a child who could not otherwise speak. Her voice was soft, vulnerable, and yet filled with undeniable truth. Max responded instantly. His tail shifted slightly, a subtle but affirming gesture. He pressed his head gently against Lily's chest, leaning into her, acknowledging her message and reaffirming his protective stance. The synchronization between them was extraordinary, a silent, instinctive dialogue that conveyed volumes without a single raised voice. Daniel Thompson's eyes widened. His confident posture faltered. For the first time during the trial, the veneer of control slipped from his shoulders. He glanced at the dog, then at the child, realizing that their bond was both deliberate and undeniable. The defense attorney rose quickly, attempting to maintain control of the courtroom. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. A child's whisper and a dog's reaction cannot constitute admissible evidence." Judge Collins's gaze was steady. She had seen the moment and recognized its significance. "This is not being presented as direct evidence of guilt," she said firmly. "It is behavioral context, relevant to understanding the child's responses and the dynamics observed by the court. The jury will consider the totality of circumstances." Max remained poised, muscles taut but controlled, his eyes unwavering. He had interpreted Lily's message, validated it, and maintained the protective stance that had become his role since the day she wandered outside. The jurors were mesmerized, scribbling notes while watching the silent witness in action. Lily's grandmother leaned down, tears glistening in her eyes. "He understands you," she whispered softly. "He knows what you need." Lily pressed her small forehead into Max's fur, her breathing slow but steady, drawing comfort and reassurance from her protector. Dr. Emily Harper, seated at the back of the courtroom, nodded toward Max. "This is classic protective behavior," she explained to the court quietly, though her words were loud enough for the jurors to hear. "The dog is responding instinctively to the child's fear cues. He interprets signals that humans might overlook and acts to mitigate perceived threats. The whisper is a clear trigger. The dog recognizes it and responds accordingly." The courtroom was captivated. The murmurs of disbelief and fascination filled the edges of the room. Spectators whispered about the extraordinary bond between child and dog, about the power of instinct, loyalty, and nonverbal communication. Reporters scribbled rapidly in their notebooks, already realizing this story would be unlike any courtroom drama they had covered. Lily's whisper, soft but precise, had broken the silence that had enveloped her life for weeks. Max's response had communicated the unspoken truth to every adult in the room. It was as if the child and the dog had combined their voices into one message. Danger is present, protection is needed, and the truth is here, even if words fail. The prosecutor carefully continued, asking Daniel about specific instances when Lily had exhibited fear at home. His responses were hesitant, strained, and lacking conviction. Max remained alert, reinforcing the child's signals, signaling the tension and uncertainty that Lily could not articulate. Judge Collins leaned forward, silent but deeply attentive. She could feel the courtroom shift around her. This was not theatrical. This was instinct and truth converging in a tangible form. A dog had become the voice of a child. Minutes stretched into tension-laden hours as questioning continued. Max's body language communicated continuously. Growls, subtle shifts, controlled postures, and protective movements. Every observer began to understand that the dog was more than a companion. He was a vital interpreter of a child's unspoken trauma. At one point, Daniel made a sudden hand movement, an innocuous gesture he had used hundreds of times. Max reacted immediately, stepping closer to Lily, lowering his head and maintaining eye contact with the perceived source of threat. The subtle growl vibrated through the room, low but potent, signaling that a boundary had been crossed. The jurors leaned in. Their understanding had deepened. This was no longer a trial of words and evidence alone. It was a demonstration of instinct, loyalty, and protective behavior that could not be fabricated or rehearsed. Lily pressed herself closer to Max, her small arms wrapped tightly around his neck. She whispered again, a barely audible repetition. "No, Max, don't let him." Max responded with a slow, deliberate movement, reinforcing his position, staying close, his presence radiating silent strength. The courtroom had transformed. A child too young to articulate her fears had been given a voice through her dog, and the message was clear to everyone present. Max was not merely reacting. He was interpreting, protecting, and communicating the child's truth. Even Daniel Thompson seemed to comprehend it now. His expression shifted from confidence to doubt, then to something deeper, recognition. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that the bond between the child and the dog could not be ignored, challenged, or dismissed. Judge Collins, observing quietly, recognized the gravity of the moment. She had presided over many extraordinary cases, but this was unprecedented. The evidence had moved beyond documentation and testimony. It had become tangible, instinctive, undeniable. When the recess was called that afternoon, the gavel echoed through the chamber. Lily pressed her face against Max's shoulder, releasing the tension she had held for weeks. Max leaned into her, alert yet calm, ready to act again if needed, a sentinel embodying loyalty and protection. Outside the courtroom, murmurs of amazement swept through the spectators and staff. The trial had reached a turning point. A whisper, a tap, a growl, these were now central to understanding the truth. For Lily, the act of speaking, even just a whisper, had been transformative. And Max, her constant guardian, had ensured that her message was understood loud and clear. The trial would continue. Evidence, testimony, and legal arguments still awaited. But in that courtroom, one truth was undeniable. Sometimes words are unnecessary when instinct, loyalty, and courage can speak louder than any testimony. And for the first time in weeks, Lily felt safe. The courtroom in Denver had grown almost unrecognizable from the ordinary proceedings of a typical family court. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. Lily Thompson, a 3-year-old who had not spoken for weeks, sat close to Max, her small frame pressed against the dog's warm fur. Max remained alert, vigilant, and unwavering, his eyes tracking Daniel Thompson at the stand. The trial had taken an extraordinary turn. A child too young to fully articulate her fear had found a voice in subtle whispers, taps, and the guidance of a golden retriever. Max's instinctive responses had become central to the court's understanding of her experiences. Every growl, shift, and protective posture communicated volumes that the adults could neither fabricate nor ignore. Daniel Thompson attempted to maintain composure, but subtle signs of unease betrayed him. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted papers before him. His eyes darted to Max, then to Lily, and finally to the judge. The dynamic had shifted dramatically. The child's silence was no longer a barrier but a bridge, interpreted flawlessly by her dog. Assistant District Attorney Maria Delgado observed from her seat, her eyes tracing every subtle cue. She had been carefully orchestrating questions to elicit both verbal and nonverbal responses from Lily. Each tap, each whisper, each shift in Max's posture was meticulously documented, forming a narrative that was both unprecedented and compelling. Dr. Emily Harper, the canine behaviorist, remained seated at the back, prepared to clarify Max's responses at any point. She had already testified to the dog's protective instincts, explaining how he interpreted Lily's cues, anticipated potential threats, and acted instinctively to shield her. Every time Daniel made a sudden movement or raised his voice, Max's subtle growl, posture adjustment, and alert stance confirmed the child's fear. The judge, Honorable Margaret Collins, presided with a steady gaze, fully aware of the gravity of what had unfolded. She had allowed Max to remain in the courtroom as an interpreter of Lily's silent testimony, an unprecedented decision that had turned conventional proceedings into a demonstration of instinct and trust. By mid-morning, the prosecution began presenting closing arguments. Maria Delgado rose slowly, her voice measured yet compelling. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, "you have witnessed something extraordinary. A child, unable to speak, has communicated her fear through her dog. Max is not merely a pet. He is a sentinel, a guardian, and an interpreter. His behavior is deliberate, protective, and consistent, and it tells a story no document or testimony could fully capture. The child's silence is not compliance. It is trauma, and the dog's instincts reveal that trauma in real time. Every growl, every shift, every protective stance is evidence of fear, vulnerability, and a need for protection. This is a message that cannot be ignored." The defense attorney rose immediately, attempting to counter. "Your Honor and ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "while the dog's behavior is observable, it is not evidence of any wrongdoing. Dogs react to stimuli all the time. These behaviors cannot be interpreted as proof of abuse. We must rely on factual, documented evidence, not instinct and interpretation. The court should not allow emotions or theatrics to sway judgment." Judge Collins nodded slightly but did not intervene. She knew the jury would weigh both arguments carefully. What no one could deny, however, was the undeniable bond between Lily and Max. That bond had transcended words, become a living, breathing witness, and communicated truths the child could not articulate. As the jurors retired to deliberate, Max remained by Lily's side. His presence was calm yet vigilant, a silent reassurance to the child. She leaned against him, tracing patterns in his fur with small, unsteady fingers, finding comfort and courage. The courtroom staff and spectators were equally captivated, fully aware that the outcome of the trial hinged not only on documents and testimony, but also on the subtle, instinctive signals of a loyal dog. Hours passed. The jurors deliberated in private, their discussions heated and meticulous. They reviewed every piece of evidence, every expert testimony, and every observation of Max's protective behavior. Videos of the interactions, notes from Dr. Harper, and the child's whispered communications were all part of their assessment. Outside the courtroom, the media speculated endlessly. "The dog who testified," read one headline. "Silent witness saves child," read another. Social media erupted with discussions about canine instincts, trauma, and the unusual yet undeniable bond between child and pet. Experts in child psychology and animal behavior weighed in, fascinated by the unprecedented case. Inside, Lily's grandmother tried to comfort the child, whispering softly, "He's right here, honey. He's protecting you." Lily responded with a small nod, pressing closer to Max. The dog rested his head gently against her shoulder, muscles relaxed but eyes alert, ever watchful, a guardian ready to act if needed. Finally, the jurors returned. The courtroom seemed to tense collectively, every person aware that a decision had been reached. The foreperson approached the bench, hands shaking slightly, carrying the weight of responsibility. Judge Collins cleared her throat. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." The courtroom went silent. Even Max seemed to sense the significance of the moment, his head lifting slightly, eyes alert. Lily shifted, tiny fingers clutching his fur, and a faint, anxious sound escaped her lips. Judge Collins motioned for the foreperson to speak. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of child neglect and endangerment," the foreperson said clearly. The words echoed through the chamber. Gasps swept through the spectators. Daniel Thompson froze, disbelief and shock washing over his features. He glanced at Max and then at Lily, the reality of the verdict settling heavily upon him. Assistant DA Delgado allowed herself a small, controlled exhale of relief. Justice, she knew, had been aided not only by evidence but by the subtle, unwavering communication of a dog who had interpreted the child's trauma perfectly. Judge Collins addressed the courtroom. "This case has been extraordinary in many ways. A young child's voice has been heard, even without conventional words, thanks to the remarkable instincts of a loyal companion. Let this serve as a reminder. Truth can manifest in forms we do not always anticipate, and protection comes in many forms, often silent but unmistakable." Lily exhaled, a tiny smile forming on her face as Max rested his head on her lap. She whispered softly, "Thank you, Max." The dog leaned into her, acknowledging the gratitude with gentle nuzzles. Outside the courtroom, the media captured the scene. Photos of Lily and Max, intertwined in a silent bond of trust and protection, circulated widely. Public fascination with the story grew, sparking discussions about trauma, child protection, and the unique role animals can play in human lives. The aftermath of the trial was profound. Social workers and psychologists praised Max's role in helping Lily communicate her trauma. The family, with guidance from authorities, began the long journey of healing, always accompanied by the golden retriever who had saved the child in ways no human could. For Lily, Max remained more than a pet. He was her voice, her shield, and her unwavering companion. The trial had tested their bond in unprecedented ways, but it had also demonstrated the extraordinary capacity of animals to perceive, protect, and communicate. And for everyone in the courtroom that day, the lesson was clear. Truth sometimes comes without words, and courage sometimes wears fur. The trial had reached its emotional peak, yet the story of Lily and Max was far from over. The child's recovery, the community's response, and the lessons learned from the extraordinary bond between a child and her dog would continue to unfold, leaving a legacy that would inspire and move many for years to come. The weeks following the trial were quieter than the courtroom had ever been, but no less intense. Lily Thompson, still just 3 years old, returned home with her grandmother, a sense of safety gradually settling over her fragile frame. Max, ever vigilant, followed closely, his presence a constant reassurance. The golden retriever had become more than a pet, more than a guardian. He was Lily's voice, her shield, and her unwavering source of comfort. Life began to take on a new rhythm. Mornings were filled with gentle walks around the neighborhood, where Lily's tiny hand gripped Max's fur tightly. The dog's calm, steady presence allowed her to explore cautiously, testing boundaries she had once feared. Every step was an exercise in trust and healing, and Max never faltered. His watchful eyes followed her every move, alert to the smallest sign of fear or hesitation. Therapists continued to work with Lily, focusing on trauma recovery and communication. They marveled at the progress she made with Max by her side. Even small gestures, a tap on his fur, a whispered word, were now understood as legitimate forms of expression. For the first time in weeks, Lily's eyes brightened as she learned that she could be heard, even without conventional speech. The community, too, became aware of the extraordinary bond that had influenced the courtroom and changed the course of justice. Local newspapers ran stories about Max, dubbing him the dog who testified. Social media spread the images of Lily leaning into Max, the golden retriever's protective stance unmistakable. Experts in animal behavior and child psychology discuss the case widely, emphasizing the power of nonverbal communication and the profound ways animals can respond to human trauma. Judge Margaret Collins received countless letters of inquiry and praise. Many readers expressed wonder and admiration for the unusual courtroom events. Some parents reached out, inspired to recognize the subtle ways their own pets might serve as emotional supports. The story became a teaching moment for both legal professionals and everyday citizens alike, illustrating how instinct, loyalty, and courage could intersect in ways no one could anticipate. At home, Lily's grandmother noticed subtle changes in the child. She smiled more often, her laughter emerging like sunlight after a long storm. She began experimenting with words, though still sparingly, and Max remained at her side, always responsive, always protective. Even the smallest gestures, a flick of his ears, a shift in his body communicated reassurance. The bond between the two was unbreakable, forged through shared fear, trust, and survival. One afternoon, the family attended a small gathering of relatives and close friends. Lily, perched on Max's back in a playful hug, whispered softly to him, "Good job, Max. You saved me." Max leaned into her, his warm breath tickling her ear, his eyes calm and wise. It was a simple moment, but profound in its significance. The dog had not just protected her physically, but had translated her unspoken fears into action, influencing the course of justice and her path to recovery. In the weeks that followed, Daniel Thompson's life took a starkly different trajectory. The verdict had been clear, and the consequences undeniable. While legal proceedings were finalized, his name became a cautionary tale in local news. But the focus remained on Lily and Max, the child and her golden guardian who had turned silence into truth. The school system, aware of Lily's experience, made accommodations to help her adjust when she eventually began attending preschool. Max continued to accompany her, allowed on special visits under supervision. Teachers and counselors observed the dog's calming influence, noting that Lily became more expressive, confident, and willing to interact socially with Max present. The courtroom's lessons had followed her home. Safety and communication were not always verbal, and protection could take many forms. Months later, Lily began to expand her vocabulary slowly, experimenting with words in short bursts. Her first clear sentence was simple: "Max is safe." It was a declaration that carried layers of meaning, affirmation, relief, and gratitude. Max, lying at her feet, responded with a gentle nudge of his nose, as if acknowledging her progress and pride. The story of Lily and Max spread beyond the local community. Animal behaviorists, psychologists, and educators studied the case, citing it as a landmark example of the ways animals can facilitate communication, especially in children who have experienced trauma. Articles were published in journals, and lectures were given at conferences, often using the case to demonstrate the profound impact of nonverbal connections. Even Judge Collins reflected on the case months later, during a conference on family court procedures. She recounted the moments she would never forget: Lily's whispers, the taps on Max's fur, and the dog's unwavering protective stance. She spoke of instinct, courage, and the extraordinary ways that truth could manifest, sometimes in ways the law could scarcely anticipate. For Lily, healing continued at its own pace. With Max by her side, she learned to trust again. She began to interact more with other children, though always keeping a watchful eye on her golden companion. Max's presence allowed her to explore the world without fear, his calm vigilance providing a foundation of security upon which she could rebuild confidence. Occasionally, visitors would remark on the dog's behavior, noting how he seemed to anticipate Lily's needs even before she articulated them. Therapists confirmed what the family already knew. Max had an exceptional capacity for empathy, attuned to the child's signals in a way that was both instinctive and remarkable. He had become her interpreter, her guardian, and her lifelong friend. One quiet evening, as the sun set over the backyard, Lily climbed into Max's fur, pressing her forehead against his shoulder. She whispered softly, barely audible, "Thank you, Max, I love you." The dog leaned into her, exhaling slowly, a gentle rumble vibrating through his chest. It was a silent conversation of gratitude, trust, and mutual understanding, one that required no words beyond what they already shared. The story of Lily and Max would continue to inspire people for years to come. Books were written, news stories recounted, and lessons taught about the power of instinct, loyalty, and nonverbal communication. But for the family, the most important lesson was simple and enduring. Courage could be silent, protection could come on four legs, and healing could begin in the presence of love and trust. Lily's journey was far from over, but she faced it with confidence, supported by Max, the golden retriever who had not only witnessed her fear but had acted on it, translating her silent cries into a force that even the court could understand. The trial was over, but the bond they shared remained, unbroken, unshakable, and filled with the quiet power of unconditional loyalty. Years later, as Lily grew, she would recall the courtroom and the whispers, the taps on fur and the low growls that had carried her voice when words could not. Max remained her protector, her friend, and her living testament to the extraordinary bond between humans and animals. He had taught her courage, loyalty, and the profound power of silent understanding. And in every chapter of her life that followed, she never forgot the dog who had become her voice, her shield, and the guardian who froze the courtroom, and the hearts of all who witnessed, with nothing more than instinct, love, and devotion. The world had learned something extraordinary that day in Denver. Sometimes the smallest witnesses can speak the loudest truths, and the heart of a loyal dog can carry the weight of justice in ways humans may never fully comprehend.